what I'd call a warm welcome. Thanks. Well, I hope you won't mind if I begin with a few truisms which are important, I think, not because they're not obvious, they are, but because they're so commonly overlooked with often terrible human consequences. The first truism is that we're very fortunate to enjoy unusual, probably unique freedom and privilege. And these benefits offer opportunity, and opportunity confers responsibility. Responsibility to use the opportunities that one enjoys wisely, honestly, and humanely. We cannot hope to do so unless we're willing to face simple truths, however uncomfortable they may be. So let me mention a few that should be on the front pages right now, in my opinion, in societies that value their freedom, but are kept under a veil of silence, not just here, where they're of utmost significance, but in Western civilization generally. A few weeks ago, we should have commemorated the 25th anniversary of the assassination of Archbishop Oscar Romero, and shortly before that, the 15th anniversary of the murder of 6 leading Latin American intellectuals, Jesuit priests. These two events frame the hideous decade of the 1980s in Central America, where the U.S. waged or supported vicious terrorist wars directed in large part against the Latin American Church, which had committed a grave crime. It had undertaken what the bishops called the preferential option for the poor, and the bishops were trying to revive the earliest centuries of church, first 3 centuries of the church, when it was the church of the poor and the oppressed. All of that changed when the Emperor Constantine received his vision, as it's called, and converted to Christianity. And now quote a distinguished Oxford University theologian, he morphed the cross from being a hated symbol of Roman brutality into the universally recognizable logo of the Holy Roman Empire. Well, shortly after, still quoting St. Augustine, developed the novel idea of just war, trimming the Church's originally pacifist message to the needs of the imperial war machine. And he does not fail to comment on the similarity to the vision of George W. Bush. Adopting liberation theology, priests, nuns, lay workers began reading the Gospels with poor peasants in the spirit of the first 3 centuries of the Church, helping them to organize to escape from misery and bitter repression. Archbishop Romero was known as the voice for the voiceless, and the Jesuit intellectuals as well. And punishment was swift and terrible. The Archbishop and the Jesuits were assassinated by security forces armed and trained by Washington, in fact by the current incumbents in Washington or their mentors. The truth commissions that finally surveyed the wreckage concluded that the same forces were also responsible for the vast majority of the other crimes in the region. That included hundreds of thousands killed, horrifying torture, and every other imaginable atrocity. Archbishop Romero was assassinated while performing Mass shortly after he wrote to President Carter, pleading with him not to send aid to the military junta that ruled El Salvador because, I'm quoting, it will surely sharpen the repression that has been unleashed against the people's organizations fighting to defend their most fundamental human rights. He was assassinated, state terror escalated with decisive U.S. support and involvement throughout, and general Western silence and complicity. Actually, not complete silence. The famous School of the Americas which trains Latin American officers, including many involved in these atrocities, it takes special pride that, I'm quoting its talking points, self-advertisement now, in that the U.S. Army helped defeat liberation theology. It's an interesting statement by the trainer of the Latin American military. And, of course, not silence in El Salvador, where Romero's anniversary was commemorated with reverence and no little despair. Or, for that matter, even in Boston, where I live, where there was at least one commemoration, maybe only one, in a church in a downtown neighborhood. It's a moving ceremony that I was privileged to be able to join, along with the widow of the leading human rights activist in El Salvador, who was imprisoned and tortured by U.S. clients, then assassinated, with the usual silence among the perpetrators, namely us. Throughout Central America, the story was much the same in those awful years. If anything remotely similar had happened in Eastern Europe, the events would be known and the anniversaries would have been commemorated, assuming, that is, that outrage had not led as far as nuclear war, which it might have. The differentiating principle is crystal clear. Our crimes do not exist. We must not remember the grim fate of those who were fighting to defend their most fundamental human rights in our own client terror states. And we must scrupulously evade our own primary responsibility for such crimes. That's probably close to a historical universal among the powerful. Actually, it's hardly unfamiliar right here. A few days before the anniversary of the Romero assassination, some at least commemorated the anniversary of the death of Rachel Corrie, another martyr in the cause of justice and peace. Also killed by our hands, though we may prefer not to notice what we can very easily see. In Latin America, the traditional domain of U.S. power and control, the grim story is continuing. For example, in Colombia, which is the leading human rights violator in the hemisphere for many years, and also the leading recipient of U.S. military aid and training. That's incidentally a correlation that holds much more broadly. It's known to scholarship, but not to the general public. For some years, more trade union activists have been killed in Colombia than the rest of the world combined. Most of the atrocities are attributed to the military and the paramilitaries, who are so closely linked that Human Rights Watch calls the paramilitaries a division of the Colombian army. A few weeks ago, the military broke into the most important of the towns that had declared itself a zone of peace, murdering many people, including women and children as young as 2, also murdering the founder, who I happened to meet in Colombia recently. He was then pleading for international support for his community of peace, then under siege by the army and paramilitaries, suffering severe hunger and state terror. No support came. The recent attack received scarcely a word in the press, illustrating once again that nonviolence is simply not permitted in client states. A few weeks ago, the United States, Washington, appointed its first director of intelligence services, John Negroponte. In the 1980s, he was the ambassador to Honduras, running the largest CIA station in the world. It's not because of the grand role of Honduras in the world scene. Rather, Negroponte's task was to supervise the military bases in Honduras for the CIA mercenary army that was attacking Nicaragua, and the secondary task was to deny vicious state terror, which he knew all about, of course, and was authorizing, in Honduras so that Congress would not impede the flow of U.S. arms to the terrorist forces. If Nicaragua had adopted Western norms, it would have responded with terrorist atrocities in the United States in self-defense, in this case legitimate self-defense. Instead, it followed the measures required by international law. It appealed to the World Court, which condemned Washington for unlawful use of force. It's a technical term which in lay terms means international terrorism, ordered the United States to terminate the crimes and to pay substantial reparations, which would more than cover the huge debt that is strangling Nicaragua as a result of the war. The court was dismissed with contempt. Washington then vetoed 2 Security Council resolutions affirming the court's judgment, and it proceeded to escalate the war, which was no small operation. The Nicaraguan death toll in per capita equivalent terms here would be 2.5 million dead in the United States. That's more than all deaths in all U.S. wars in history combined, including the Civil War. By now, 60% of young children suffer severe malnutrition, probable brain damage. To save them, no feeding tubes are needed, just the very conservative but unthinkable process of obeying the law and paying what is owed. There's been virtually no reaction in the West, not just here, to the appointment of a condemned international terrorist to the top counterterrorism position in the world. I think Orwell wouldn't have known whether to laugh or to weep. It's unfortunately all too easy to continue, but I'll put that aside and turn to a more general question, the general question of the resort to force in international affairs and how its legitimacy has been understood over time. As you know, the unspeakable crimes of the 20th century led to dedicated efforts to save humans from the curse of war. Phrase of the opening words of the UN Charter. And the word save is no exaggeration. Surely, since it became clear in 1945 that the likelihood of ultimate doom is well beyond what any rational person should be willing to tolerate. Actually, the phrase ultimate doom is not mine. As a more interesting source, I'm borrowing it from 2 prominent strategic analysts writing in the very sober and respectable Journal of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, not given to hyperbole. They conclude that Washington's current programs, military programs, and aggressive stance, I'm quoting them, carry an appreciable risk of ultimate doom. And they urge the U.S. political system to acknowledge that the United States is the dominant threat to everyone else. They add that the terrifying technology now being developed in what's called the transformation of the military will assuredly diffuse to the rest of the world, and the competition and intimidation led by Washington creates rising danger, potentially an unmanageable one, of course, for Americans as well. The authors express the hope that the threat that the United States government is posing to the world and to its own citizens will be countered by a coalition of peace-loving nations led by China. We've come to a pretty pass when such thoughts are expressed right at the heart of the establishment. And what that implies about the state of Western democracy, to which they don't appeal, is no less shocking. The appraisal by these analysts is by no means unusual. So in the current issue of Britain's leading Journal of International Affairs, former NATO planner Michael Maguire writes that under current policies, a nuclear exchange is ultimately inevitable. And like many others, Maguire concludes that the only hope for decent survival is the elimination of nuclear weapons in accord with the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT. And adherence to international law. Those are the two requirements. As for international law, he writes that, I'm quoting, there were many reasons for concluding before the event that the decision to wage war in Iraq was fundamentally flawed. But in the longer term, by far the most important was that the decision repudiated a century of slow, intermittent, and often painful progress towards an international system based on cooperative security, multilateral decision-making, collective action, agreed norms of behavior, and a steadily growing fabric of law. That's the thin fabric on which the hopes for survival precariously hang. In a few weeks, the 5-year review conference of the NPT will take place. That's actually the subject of a current article by Thomas Graham. He's the former U.S. Special Representative for Arms Control, Disarmament, and Non-Proliferation, and he's the author of a recent book on these topics published by University of Washington Press. He writes in this article that the NPT has never seemed weaker or the future less certain, and if the treaty should fail at the renewal in a couple of weeks, a nuclear nightmare world may become reality. Like other analysts, he recognizes that the primary threat to the NPT is U.S. government policy, though the other nuclear states share responsibility. The NPT was a compact in which the nuclear powers pledged to take good faith efforts to eliminate nuclear weapons. That's the crucial Article 6 of the NPT. And none of them have done so, and the United States is planning even more severe violations by developing new nuclear weapons, which will tear what's left of the treaty to shreds. The Bush administration alone announced that it no longer supports some of the Article 6 conclusions, the crucial ones for the nuclear states. The bargain was also based on a commitment to several additional treaties. One was the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, which was rejected by the Republican Senate in 1999 and declared off the agenda by Bush. Secondly, the ABM Treaty, which Bush rescinded. And most important, a verifiable fissile material cutoff treaty, FISBAN it's called, which would block the terrible threat of adding, quoting Graham, adding more nuclear bomb material to the vast amount already existing. Last November, the UN Committee on Disarmament voted in favor of a verifiable FISBAN treaty. The vote was 147 to 1. A negative vote by the United States is, in effect, a veto. In fact, it's a double veto. Typically, it means that the resolution is blocked, and it's also barred from reporting and from history. I doubt if a tiny fraction of people here say never heard of this. As far as I know, it was never reported. As had been predicted, one consequence of Washington's aggressive militarism was to drive Russia, and now probably China, to significant expansion of offensive capacities, just as a countermeasure. That's posing a very serious threat to the world, even a threat of accidental war, because the systems are on hair-trigger alert. They're automated systems, and they regularly fail. We know that of our own systems, constantly failing. A related and theirs are much worse, than far deteriorated and so on. A related and, in fact, very serious concern is that nuclear weapons may sooner or later fall into the hands of terrorist groups. Those grim prospects are also being enhanced by Bush administration aggressive militarism, quite consciously. None of this is secret. One consequence is that Russia is continually transferring nuclear weapons across its vast territory to counter mounting U.S. threats. Prominent strategic analysts point out that terrorists may steal such weapons, which could spell disaster to an American city, I'm quoting, and still worse, the seizure of a ready-to-fire strategic missile capable of delivering bombs to targets thousands of miles away could be apocalyptic for entire nations. Bruce Blair could be apocalyptic for entire nations. That's Bruce Blair, the head of the Center for Defense Information in the Washington Post. These dangers are being consciously escalated by the threat and use of violence, which, as was widely predicted, is stimulating nuclear proliferation, along with the jihadi terrorism that traces back to Reagan administration programs to organize, arm, and train radical Islamists, not for the defense of Afghanistan, as was proclaimed, but for much more ugly and familiar reasons of state. Well, that much is, or at least should be, familiar, but less well known is the tolerance of the present incumbents in Washington in their Reaganite phase, their tolerance for Pakistan's slide towards radical Islamist extremism under the rule of one of the many brutal dictators they supported. Saddam was not the only one. Another in Pakistan was Zia-ul-Haq, and also as a result of their willingness to look away while their ally was developing nuclear weapons. Reagan annually endorsed the pretense that Pakistan was not developing them, though U.S. intelligence knew perfectly well that they were, and his successors paid little attention, while Pakistan's leading proliferator, now tapped on the wrist, was carrying out what appears to be the most extraordinary nuclear smuggling enterprise ever. The invasion of Iraq is another case in point. It was undertaken with the expectation that it would probably increase the threat of terror. Among many others, that was predicted by U.S. intelligence agencies in their report to the President a few weeks before the invasion. And the predictions came true, as now confirmed by intelligence agencies and strategic analysts. The conclusions are also confirmed by U.S. intelligence. Its most recent analysis, a couple of months ago, concludes that the invasion of Iraq created a new training area for professional terrorists who will disperse throughout the world, replacing the Afghan havens that were established at first by the Reagan administration and its British and Pakistani allies. The official reason for the invasion of Iraq was that it was developing weapons of mass destruction, and the U.S. and Britain therefore proclaimed the right to invade in what was called anticipatory self-defense. That was what they called the single question that was stressed constantly by Bush, Blair, Powell, and other high officials, the single question. As is now conceded, there weren't any weapons of mass destruction, apart from what had been produced in the 1980s, thanks to aid provided by the U.S. and Britain, along with others, which continued long after Saddam Hussein's worst atrocities and long after the end of the war with Iran. After the invasion, the U.S.-British invasion in 2003, there was sophisticated, massive looting of the installations that were constructed in the 1980s. That includes high-precision equipment capable of making parts for nuclear and chemical weapons and missiles, and also toxins for biological weapons. Prior to the U.S.-British invasion, these sites had been monitored by UN inspectors, but they were quickly kicked out of the country and have not been back since, while the occupation forces left the sites unguarded. And very sophisticated looting operations took place. Where this huge, massive equipment has gone, no one knows, and it's uncomfortable to guess. The ironies are almost inexpressible. The U.S. and Britain invaded to prevent the use of weapons of mass destruction that did not exist, and they succeeded in providing the terrorists that they had mobilized with the means to develop weapons of mass destruction that the U.S. and Britain had provided to Saddam Hussein. I mean, the fact that those are not major headlines in every day's newspaper is mind-boggling. Well, there are many other examples of the willingness of top planners to risk international terrorism, which by now can have awesome consequences, as they know well. It's not, of course, that they welcome terrorism. Rather, it's simply that it's just not a high priority in comparison with other objectives, such as controlling the world's major energy resources, which is in the Middle East, which are to become even more significant soon. ExxonMobil, major oil company, which has been pretty conservative about this, recently published a 30-year expectations for the next 30 years. And for the first time ever, they've mentioned peak oil, when it could come. And they make the astonishing prediction that within 5 years, the non-OPEC countries will reach the peak of oil production. After that, it begins to decline. And the only hope that they see for more oil is sharply increased production of the OPEC countries, which means primarily the Persian Gulf. So the need to control, not necessarily access, but to control this oil is extraordinary importance. One of the more astute of the senior planners and analysts, Zbigniew Brzezinski, recently pointed out that control of Iraq gives the United States what he calls critical leverage over its European and Asian rivals, the real enemies. He was reiterating conclusions of leading planners after World War II who recognized that control over what they called the stupendous source of strategic power in the Gulf region, that control of it would give the United States veto power over its industrial rivals. That's George Kennan in this case. It's a rational calculation on the assumption that human survival is not particularly significant in comparison with power and wealth. And that's nothing new. That's a theme that resonates through history. The difference is today is only that the stakes are enormously higher. I mean, they really are survival. In 1945, the efforts to end the curse of war led to a consensus on the principles that should guide state action that's formalized in the UN Chart. That consensus was reiterated last December by a high-level UN panel, which included the National Security Advisor for George Bush I, Brent Scowcroft. The panel reaffirmed the conditions of the Charter, that force can be deployed only when authorized by the Security Council or in defense against armed attack until the Security Council acts. Any other resort to force is a war crime, in fact, the supreme international crime, differing only from other war crimes in that it contains within itself the accumulated evil of the whole. That's a quoting from the judgment of the Nuremberg Tribunal. The December 2004 panel concluded that these conditions, in their words, should be neither rewritten nor reinterpreted. The panel then adds an important comment. It says, for those impatient with such a response, the answer must be that in a world full of perceived potential threats, the risk to global order and the norm of non-intervention on which it continues to be based is simply too great for the legality of unilateral preventive action as distinct from collectively endorsed action to be accepted. Allowing one to so act is to allow all. That last sentence is important. It presupposes a principle that's the foundation of every moral code that merits even the slightest attention, namely the principle of universality. We apply to ourselves the same standards we do to others, if we're serious, more stringent ones. But that principle is flatly rejected in the intellectual, moral, political culture of the most powerful states, which again raises the prospects of ultimate doom. Actually, that comment to the UN panel was responding very directly to several years of enthusiastic support by Western intellectuals for the resort to force by their own states on alleged humanitarian grounds. That's another very familiar theme throughout history, including the worst monsters. In the last Hitler, for example, very humanitarian if you look at the rhetoric. In the last years of the last millennium, across the spectrum of elite opinion in the West, there was a claim for, quoting now, for the idealistic new world bent on ending inhumanity, which had entered a noble phase of its foreign policy with a saintly glow. For the first time in history, a state is dedicated to principles and values, acting from altruism and moral fervor alone as the leader of the enlightened states, hence free to resort to force for what its leaders determined to be right. And that's a tiny sample of an extraordinary deluge, drawn in this case only from the most respected liberal voices, and in my opinion one of the most embarrassing moments of intellectual history, which is not a very elevated history. These declarations reflect elite perceptions, but not those of the general public. It's important to know that a large majority of the American public continue to take the position expressed in the UN Charter, namely the position that states are entitled to use force only if, I'm quoting from the polls now, only if there is strong evidence that the country is in imminent danger of being attacked. So a large majority of the public reject the bipartisan consensus on what's called preemptive war and agree with the recent UN panel, and incidentally agree with what used to be called the non-aligned movement, the governments of 80% of the world's population who have forcefully issued similar declarations, but they're of course ignored or dismissed with derision. What do they matter? The legitimacy of the use of force is not the only issue on which the public opinion in the United States diverges sharply from elite political culture. So to take another current example, which also raises issues of survival, you commonly read many times, that the U.S. refused to join the Kyoto Treaty a month ago. That's only true if the phrase United States excludes its population, who overwhelmingly the population overwhelmingly support ratification of the treaty. In fact, support it so enthusiastically that a majority of Bush voters believe that he agreed with them that the U.S. should join the treaty because it's so obvious. Large majorities also believe that the U.S. should accept the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court and the World Court, should rely on the United Nations to take the lead in international crises. That happens to include issues of security, reconstruction, and political transition in Iraq. Most of the population even believe that the U.S. should abandon the Security Council veto, which is quite a surprising result. In other words, accept majority rule, even if the U.S. is opposed. Actually, the same is true on a host of other issues. So large majorities believe that the U.S. should rely on diplomatic and economic measures more than military ones in the so-called war on terror, and overwhelming majorities, as in the past, favor increased government spending on health care, education, and other social spending. Needless to say, all of this is in sharp opposition to the bipartisan consensus. Studies revealing these facts were released by the most prestigious institutions that monitor public attitudes shortly before the November presidential elections. Studies were carried out and released in time for the elections. Well, plainly, they're of critical importance for functioning democracy. What the studies reveal is that both political parties are far to the right of the population on many of the most crucial issues. They were scarcely reported, barely a word. And those observations, unfortunately, generalize. That lends further weight to the judgment of the strategic analysts I quoted earlier about the state of Western democracy. In Europe, they weren't reported at all. The crisis they see as so serious that we should turn to China to rescue us from disaster. Washington's unilateral right to resort to force was articulated publicly by the Bush administration in its national security strategy of September 2002. However, that broke no new ground. So even before the year 2000 election, Condoleezza Rice wrote an article in Foreign Affairs, the main establishment journal, in which she condemned what she called the reflexive appeal to notions of international law and norms, and the belief that the support of many states, or even better, of institutions like the United Nations, is essential to the legitimate exercise of power. And by the United States, of course, the usual exception prevails. Rice's dismissal of international law and norms is reiterated in the National Defense Strategy, which was just released, which declares, I'm quoting it, that our strength as a nation state will continue to be challenged by those who employ a strategy of the weak, using international forums, judicial processes, and terrorism. Okay? So international law and other peaceful means are a dangerous challenge to the U.S. freedom to resort to violence at will. It might be useful, if not particularly pleasant, to search for precedents for these widely held views among educated elites. That is, the public disagrees, but it's kept silent. Well, at the margins, you do find more nuanced opinions on the resort to force. One of the most important of them is the International Independent Commission of Inquiry on the Kosovo War, which was headed by a distinguished South African jurist, Justice Richard Goldstone. The commission concluded that the NATO bombing of Serbia was, in their words, illegal but legitimate. It was, they recognized, in gross violation of the fundamental principles of international law, but I'm now quoting, it was legitimate because all diplomatic avenues had been exhausted and there was no other way to stop the killing and atrocities in Kosovo. Justice Goldstone, who headed it, concluded that the UN Charter may need revision in the light of the report of the Commission that he headed, because the NATO bombing is too important a precedent to be disregarded. I mean, as distinct, say, from Iraq's invasion of Kuwait, which isn't a precedent. Depends who carries it out, as always. Notice that his conclusion is the conclusion that was explicitly rejected by the UN panel that reviewed this and other cases last December. Goldstone also stressed the need for objective analysis, which is good advice. So let's try some of that. One question that objective analysis might address is whether indeed it is true that all diplomatic options had been exhausted in Kosovo. When NATO decided to bomb, there were two diplomatic options on the table. There was a NATO proposal and a Serbian proposal. After 78 days of bombing, a compromise was reached between them, though NATO instantly violated it. Well, you know, fanatics on all sides know whether diplomatic options were available. But those of us who are restricted to evidence can only conclude that there may well have been diplomatic options, so it appears. A second question is whether, again, there was no other way to stop the killings and atrocities in Kosovo, as the Independent Commission asserts, clearly a very crucial matter. Those of you, I'm sure you recall that at that time, March 1999, it was constantly described as genocide right before the bombing, hundreds of reports in the media at the time, and that continues until today, including, incidentally, current scholarship. So it was genocide. Was there any other way to stop it? Well, here objective analysis happens to be unusually easy. There is a vast documentary record from impeccable Western sources. The State Department published 2 major collections of documents seeking to justify the bombing. British parliamentary inquiry issued an extensive report of it. There was massive evidence from NATO, from the OSCE, the monitors, and many others. They all reached the same conclusion. Overwhelmingly, the killings and atrocities followed the bombing. In the extensive literature, followed the bombing. In the extensive literature on the topic, from media to scholarship, the documentation is almost universally ignored. Interesting experiment to take a look and see. It's there, but it's ignored. And worse, the chronology is reversed, so that the bombing is presented as a reaction to the atrocities, as in the Independent Commission report, although unquestionably it's the other way around. At least we can believe the State Department, the British Parliament, NATO, and others. There's an extensive literature on this in media and scholarship. I've reviewed it, and I won't, in print, I will put that dismal record aside, but it's a very revealing one about the nature of the moral and intellectual culture in which we live. We're not talking about some, remote tribe in New Guinea that we don't understand. We're talking about ourselves. Well, the consequences of the bombing came as no surprise. They were predicted at once by NATO Commander General Wesley Clark, quite publicly, when the bombing began, predicted, yes, going to lead to massive atrocities. The Clinton administration also anticipated the crimes that followed the bombing. We knew that at the time, and it's confirmed in much more detail in General Clark's memoirs. Kosovo was, and in fact, if you look at the Milosevic indictment, which was issued right in the middle of the bombing, it's crimes after the bombing. There's actually one exception, a couple of months earlier, but the entire indictment is based on crimes after the bombing. It's amazing to be able to conceal this. I mean, the facts are just not even remotely in question. Well, Kosovo was, in fact, an ugly place before the NATO bombing. That was March 1999. Regrettably, it was not a particularly ugly place by international standards. According to the major Western sources, as I mentioned, about 2,000 people were killed in the year prior to the invasion. That's when it became an international issue. Many of them were killed by KLA guerrillas, Albanian guerrillas, attacking Serbs from Albania in an effort, as they openly announced, in an effort to elicit a harsh Serbian response that could rally Western opinion to their cause. The British government, which is the most hawkish element of the alliance, they make the astonishing claim that until January 1999, most of the killings were the responsibility of the KLA guerrillas attacking from Albania. And the rich Western documentation reveals that nothing substantial changed until the NATO bombing 2 months later. When this claim first came out, I assumed that they don't mean it because it seems so impossible, but it's now reiterated in the British Parliamentary Inquiry report, so evidently that is their position. It's also there's one scholarly study, serious one, that even considers these matters seriously. It's a careful and judicious study by a British scholar, Nicholas Wheeler, He estimates that Serbs were responsible for 500 of the 2,000 people killed. He supports the NATO bombing on the grounds that there would have been worse atrocities if NATO had not bombed. So the argument is that by bombing at a time when most of the atrocities were attributed to the KLA guerrillas, with the anticipation that the bombing would lead to far worse atrocities, NATO was preventing atrocities. The fact that this is the strongest argument that can be contrived by serious analysts, and I stress serious because there's plenty of nonsense, that tells us a good deal about the decision to bomb, particularly when we recall that there apparently were diplomatic options. Well, Kosovo is worth keeping in mind because that's one of the two great achievements that's brought forth to give retrospective proof that for the first time in history, states are observing principles and values under the guidance of their Anglo-American tutors, and that the UN Charter has to be revised to allow the West to carry out what it calls humanitarian intervention. The other example that's brought up is East Timor. That example is truly atrocious. The fact that it can even be brought up without shame is a remarkable comment on Western intellectual culture, and here almost the entire West is complicit, although the U.S.-British role is by far the worst. That's extensively discussed in print too, so I'll skip it. It ought to be well known, and I'll skip some other examples that merit discussion and I think lead to essentially the same conclusion. Well, there's one case that can't be ignored. That's the Bush-Blair invasion of Iraq, justified solely by Iraq's refusal to obey Security Council orders to stop developing weapons of mass destruction, as Washington and London constantly stressed. Well, as you know, after the collapse of these pretexts, we were informed that the justification was not anticipatory self-defense, as had been solemnly proclaimed, but rather it was what the liberal press calls Bush's messianic vision to bring democracy to the world. It's the way the new version was described without irony. Presidents prior to Bush had principles and doctrines and so on, but Bush only has visions. If you read, it's interesting to read the media commentary on it. It's all they have. He's the first person to have visions all the time. I suspect that the reason why the PR operatives do this is because of his father was criticized for lacking what was called the vision thing. So he's going to have plenty of visions, you know, and there are, sometimes you see half a dozen references in the same article. It's worth interesting journalistic convention. Well, the reaction to Bush's messianic vision after the pretext collapsed was quite interesting. I reviewed it pretty extensively. There was a range. It ranged from rapturous awe to critical commentary, which praised the nobility and generosity of the vision, but warned that it may be beyond our means, the beneficiaries are too backward, it might prove too costly. That this was the guiding vision is presupposed throughout as self-evident, so you don't have to give any evidence for it, it just is. Actually, it's hard to find an exception within the mainstream. You might try. All that was missing was evidence. So apparently the declarations of the leadership suffice. And a mass of counter-evidence up to the present can be dismissed as irrelevant, very much as in the, say in the manner of North Korea, for example, which would react the same way if the dear leader produced a messianic vision. Actually, there was one exception to this, I have to admit. In the coverage in the United States, there was one exception to the rapture over the vision and so on. It was published in the Washington Post a couple of days after Bush announced his messianic vision with great pomp in Washington and great acclaim. The Post did report a poll taken in Iraq where people were in Baghdad were asked why they thought the U.S. invaded. And some agreed with 100% of Western opinion. 1%. 1% said the goal was to bring democracy. The rest said what's kind of obvious. The U.S. invaded, U.S. and Britain invaded to take control of Iraq's resources. Actually, reactions were much more subtle and nuanced if you look closely. 50% of the same people said the U.S. wants democracy, which sounds like a contradiction since 1% said that its goal was democracy, but it's not a contradiction because those backward people are not so as ignorant of American history as we are. What they said is the 50% said the U.S. wants democracy, but it's not going to allow Iraq to exercise it. So it wants a kind of democracy in which the U.S. will control it, which is plenty of historical evidence for that. And they're probably relying on their own history because that's what Britain had done for, half a century. So the backward people are not always as stupid as we claim. There should be some, witnesses for the defense of the messianic vision, and the strongest witnesses should be the leading scholars and the most enthusiastic advocates of what's called democracy promotion. Actually, the most prominent among them is the director of the Democracy and Rule of Law Project at the Carnegie Endowment, Thomas Carruthers, who's a good, careful scholar. He's just published a helpful book on the topic, reviewing the record of democracy promotion since the end of the Cold War. Remember, he's a strong enthusiast. He finds what he calls a strong line of continuity running through all administrations, I'm quoting, where democracy appears to fit in well with U.S. security and economic interests, the United States promotes democracy. Where democracy clashes with significant interests, it's downplayed or ignored. In fact, actually eliminated, but doesn't say that. He says all administrations are schizophrenic in this regard. Some kind of psychic malady, needs some psychiatrists, and they're schizophrenic with curious consistency. Okay. He doesn't draw any conclusions from it, but he does predict with regret that Iraq policies will likely exhibit similar contradictions between stated principles and political reality, or schizophrenia. Well, it did not take long for his predictions to be fulfilled. The Octavian authorities worked very hard to prevent the threat of democracy, but they were compelled with great reluctance to permit elections. That's a major triumph of nonviolent resistance. The U.S. doesn't care that much about suicide bombers in the arena of violence. It prevails overwhelmingly, but the mass nonviolent resistance simply could not be ignored, and it forced elections. The Ayatollah Sistani is a kind of a symbol of it. There are very few competent observers who would disagree with the editors of the world's leading business daily, the London Financial Times, who wrote that after the elections that the reason the elections took place was the insistence of the Grand Ayatollah Ali Sistani, who vetoed 3 schemes by the U.S.-led occupation authorities to shelve or dilute elections. Of course, he couldn't do it alone. It's because there was mass popular nonviolent resistance, demonstrations, and so on, that the U.S. and Britain couldn't resist. That's a major triumph of nonviolent resistance and should be understood that way. Of course, once the elections had to take place, the U.S. took credit for them, but that's normal. After failing to block the elections, Bush and Blair literally did not waste one moment in declaring that they intended to subvert them. Both Bush and Blair announced right away that there would be no timetable for withdrawal of U.S. troops. Both governments are well aware that, according to their own polls, an overwhelming majority of Iraqis want the occupying forces withdrawn from their territories, in fact want them so strongly that even the U.S. candidate, Iyad Alawi, had to join his competitors by including this as a plank in his electoral program. Similar conflicts persist over Iraqi resistance to the efforts by the occupying forces, the Bremer occupation administration, to impose economic arrangements which essentially open up the economy to take over by foreign corporations, mainly U.S. and British. So the strong line of continuity persists, exactly as Carruthers predicted it would, regretfully. Carruthers also happens to have written the standard scholarly work on democracy promotion in Latin America in the 1980s. This is in part from an insider's perspective. He was serving in Reagan's State Department in the programs that were called democracy enhancement. And so he's writing both as an insider and a scholar. He regards the Reagan programs as sincere, although he says a failure, and an oddly systematic failure. As he points out, where U.S. influence was least, namely in the Southern Cone in South America, progress towards democracy was greatest. And where U.S. influence was greatest, namely the regions nearby, progress was least. And he even gives the reason. The reason, he says, is that the U.S. would tolerate, I'm quoting, only limited top-down forms of democratic change that did not risk upsetting the traditional structures of power with which the United States has long been allied in fundamentally undemocratic countries. Washington sought to maintain the basic order of quite undemocratic societies and avoid populist-based change. So in short, the strong line of continuity goes back a decade earlier to its Reaganite roots. I should mention that he regards himself as a neo-Reaganite. In fact, the strong line of continuity goes back far before. Democracy promotion has always been proclaimed as a guiding vision, but it's not even controversial that the U.S. regularly overthrew democratic governments, often installing or supporting brutal tyrannies. Now, this consistent practice is not denied. It's too obvious to deny, but it's usually explained away as somehow in terms of Cold War imperatives, which in fact had very little relevance, often none, as you discover when you investigate case by case. What we do find, however, is the same strong line of continuity. Democracy is a good thing if and only if it is consistent with strategic and economic interests. Well, none of this should elicit any surprise. The record, consistent and rich record, really merely reveals that the United States is very much like other powerful states, past and present. It pursues the strategic and economic interests of dominant internal sectors. Democracy is fine as long as it takes the top-down form that does not risk popular interference with the primary interests of power and wealth. Incidentally, there's no time to go into it, but the same is true if you look carefully of what are called the great achievements in Europe and Japan after the Second World War. It was very much the same if you look well known in scholarship. And much the same doctrine holds internally, where enormous efforts are made, quoting now, to protect the minority of the opulent from the majority, quoting James Madison, who informed his colleagues that that's a primary goal of government. He's, of course, the framer of the American constitutional system. That's what he explained to them at the Constitutional Convention. And that's the way the country was set up, to protect the minority of the opulent from the majority. Well, over the centuries, popular struggles have chipped away at that and gained many victories for freedom and democracy. But progress does not follow a smooth upward trajectory. We see that today. one of the repeated periods of regression. And we see it quite visibly in the United States, but increasingly in Europe as well, and in part, large part, for quite similar underlying reasons. Well, finish up, I mentioned a small sample of cases of major significance for the future. Ranking high among them is the propriety of the use of force. Careful inquiry might unearth genuine cases of intervention that are illegal but legitimate, but there's always a heavy burden of proof. The prize example that's offered, namely Kosovo, tends to reinforce the measured judgment of the World Court in 1949, which they reaffirmed in the Nicaragua case and others, and which was recently reiterated by the UN panel, high-level UN panel, last December. The court in 1949 concluded that the court can only regard the alleged right of intervention as the manifestation of a policy of force, such as has in the past given rise to most serious abuses, and such as cannot, whatever be the defects in international organization, find a place in international law. From the nature of things, intervention would be reserved for the most powerful states and might easily lead to perverting the administration of justice itself. That's a judicious understatement, as they knew. Inquiry does very definitely reveal that state terror and other forms of threat and use of force have brought the world very close to the edge of ultimate doom, shockingly so. Today, surely only the most blind and irrational will ignore the call that was issued by Bertrand Russell and Alfred Einstein exactly 50 years ago. They said, "Here then is the problem which we present to you, stark and dreadful and inescapable. Shall we put an end to the human race, or shall mankind renounce war?" Thanks. I think there should be some mics.
I'm back.
Oh, you're back?
Yeah.
Are there some mics out there?
There are. In fact, I'm going to get one.
Okay, we're going to get a mic, and you guys can join in.
Well, I know that everyone here has one or more questions for Professor Chomsky, and he's graciously agreed to stay until they're all answered. So we can relax, and he'll get to every one before the evening is over. I've actually been. The questions are going to come to us.
Oh, I see.
Although we could just pass the mic through the audience. That would be another way to do this.
Easier.
But I've been asked by the organizers to remain organized at this point in the program. It's too bad, isn't it? So what we're going to do is take those cards that I believe most of you filled out with your question for Professor Chomsky and pass them down the aisles. There are people on the sides of the aisles collecting them. And someone in the back room is going to make a selection based on editorial standards that I don't know anything about, and we'll get a collection of questions in a moment. But this gives me the wonderful opportunity to ask the first question or two, if I may. And what I'd like to ask is, based on my sense of at least three really big themes in your talk tonight, and indeed your work in general. One is the incredible and somewhat systematic disconnection between the preferences of majorities of the people in this country and the policies and actions of the elites who apparently are running the country. A second theme is that disconnection tends to seldom make the headlines. that what does make the headlines are the policies and actions and the quibbles and sometimes squabbles among the elites. And the third theme, which seems to me crucial as I grasp this overview of the world, is that the policies that come out of these two elements of our democracy are greatly dysfunctional. It is not that the elites are wiser than the people and therefore must make these decisions on their behalf. It is that they're making decisions in isolation from the intelligence of the people in the democracy that is designed to make the public intelligence available to elites when they decide. And so the results are less than desirable. So my question is, turning back to your linguist side, is this a deep grammar of empire? Is this a deep grammar that all empires follow? And if so, where is the potential in here to seize back control of democracy and make better choices?
Well, of your 3 points, I actually agree with 2. There is a consistent disconnect. You find this all the time. Right now it has to be extremely dramatic. And secondly, yes, it not only doesn't make the headlines, it rarely even gets reported. In fact, the extent to which it is unknown is just dramatic. I mean, the fact that these major studies right before the election were barely reported, they were even mentioned in the national press, that's pretty striking. And it, I'm sure, reflects editorial awareness that you better not let people know what public opinion is. It's hard to think of any other reason. In fact, sometimes it's shockingly dramatic. Like you'll remember, I'm sure, that a year ago, in March 2004, Spain voted out the government. And the reaction here was kind of interesting. The